Mashujaa, round 5, the motion before the House. This House supports the decision by the Government of Kenya to lift the ban on GMOs. Having said that, we'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open up the debate. Hear, hear.
Yeah. Okay, great. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, panel, we think there are essential things that need to be understood and cleared out of the debate even before the opposition side comes into today's debate. What is the characterization of GMO foods? Because we don't want any funny debate as to what exactly, or GMO crops, as to what exactly is happening. These are crops that have been genetically changed, which means a particular gene of these crops have been edited or removed to yield a particular result in terms of their growth, in terms of what exactly these crops look like. For example, cassava and beans have been genetically modified to withstand pest invasions within certain instances. Note that this is not the same as the synthetic generation of food, which is also another technology that exists. This is taking a particular crop, changing a gene to yield a particular result, as in the example I have given. Second characterization is that we don't expect any argumentation as to, oh, they are so expensive, because generally they are not. DNA replication exists as a technology that I can do in my lab in school. We don't think they are so complicated that we need some sort of overarching expenses to actually do this. In the worst case scenario, the technology exists, we can actually adopt to it. But then the second most important characterization within today's debate is the nature of what exactly happens in Kenya and why we think the supporting of this ban is supporting of lifting this ban is crucial in today's debate. Is that one, within 2021 up till today, there have been constant droughts within these areas. 2, millions of people are suffering from things like food insecurity. Climate change and global warming have made weather predictions so terrible that you cannot tell exactly when rains are going to fall, so you need to plant ahead, or you need to ensure that you don't plant so that your crops don't die out within today's debate. Generally, between 2021 and 2022, there's been a significant shortfall of food within these spaces. What then happens is that there's a constant drive towards a food security crisis, and there's generally food that is even already available has become more expensive, even more scarce within today's status quo. We think any alternative that then alleviates this situation is one that we support from government side. Before I continue, any POI?
Yes. So you can produce a few in your school lab to serve about 1 or 2 farmers. We are talking about producing to serve an entire agricultural economy, not for school exercise.
So at the end of the day, I produce in my school lab for myself because that's what's important. If we are producing on a large scale and selling at a large scale, we generate that money. That's an irrelevant POI. But then we need to understand, again, why exactly the ban was instituted again in 2012. In 2012, there was a discredited, which means it is proven to no longer be true, that rats that consume GMOs were getting cancer at the end of the day, coupled with a lot of cultural factors that were made it more widespread, because generally this is a very new technology that is being developed. Understand that the fact that it's new doesn't mean it is bad, and the fact that it's new doesn't mean there's no regulation to it, because there's constant regulations. Even these regulations are under constant review to ensure that they're of the best quality and ensuring that food security and food health in general are of the best circumstances within today's debate. But then secondly, apart from the fact that this report was discredited and the technology is new, the third thing is just the general perception on most societies or most people on the idea that you are changing nature in essence, because now cassava that is supposed to be destroyed by rats is no longer being destroyed by rats because you've changed a particular gene that makes it appealing to rats. What then happens is there's a general perception that this is a very bad thing because that is not how cassavas were made to be. Panel, understand that these things essentially are catered for because technology that comes out new in itself is generally not accepted by majority of people within society up until a point where it provides very utility or becomes very necessary within today's debate. We think at a point where it provides a utility and in dire need of situations within people, what we get is a world where even if the perceptions exist, we are better able to get rid of them because of the proof of how much utility we get out of this. But then the second question is then, why can't we import more food food generally, or why can't we just buy food from other places, is that one, most countries around Kenya, most eastern countries, are also suffering equal droughts. So you can't import from them, or you are largely importing at a ridiculous amount of money. Or two, you're importing for a far place, which then equally costs more within today's debate. We don't think those alternatives are very important, especially when we have a better solution in GMOs that ensure that we can sustain the agricultural economy within the status quo. So at the end of the day, what are the impacts that we think are very important in today's debate that when opening governments the debate? Is that one, that you solve the food insecurity. How does this happen? By getting more genetically modified crops, you have the ability to increase the farming advantage of these people. So now I don't have to use so much fertilizer, I don't have to use so much pesticides, I don't have to constantly worry about a pest invasion, a cricket invasion, a grasshopper invasion into my farms because my crops have been genetically modified. What you do is you upscale the kind of farming that happens within these states. What then happens is you cure the kind of hunger that exists within these spaces. Constantly, I've told you about how the droughts exist within these spaces and pose a critical danger as to what happens within status quo. But then secondly, you also resolve the issue of expensive food, because what then happens is that you are producing at a large number of scale, you are providing more goods in general. More goods in general mean they are the prices in themselves are regulated because there's an abundance of these goods within status quo. We think we solve that. But then the third thing is you provide more jobs within the agricultural sector. Understand how Kenya and many more African countries depend on the agricultural sector because of the nature in which these lands are. We think the most important thing is that when a country is so dependent on the agricultural sector, or when the GDP is reliant on the agricultural sector, even to any extent whatsoever, the most important thing is to ensure that this agricultural sector can survive. Before I continue, yes?
Who is the most important stakeholder in today's debate?
Yeah, I'm getting to that. The most vulnerable people within society and how we cater for them. At the end of the day, I've shown you how governments are going to benefit because the agricultural sector then survive. The second most important people are the vulnerable people like you and I who cannot afford to buy a bag of rice at 3,000 shillings within a day because of the kind of droughts that exist. The poor people who have no money, the farmers who have the ability to worry about whether rains are going to fall or whether their crops are going to withstand the climate changes. Genetically modified foods ensure that there's a provision of food that is not so expensive for you and I to buy because we cannot just afford such expensive things. The most important people, the most vulnerable people are catered for within today's debate. But then notice how this also factors into things like the health sector and the economical sector within status quo. Health sector, panel notes, most of the deaths that occur by food as a result of one, either hunger, or two, consuming things or foods that are not beneficial or healthy for people or that are not approved. What we do is ensure that these foods that are coming out are very well enough to control the kind of hunger situations and ensure that people have an availability of food at every point in time. When you have that, you just have the ability to survive as a human being within this economy. When you don't have the food to survive, I'm unsure of as to what point that you are able to ensure that you can work, that you can live the next day. We think we win on that. On the economy, my partner will analyze more, but at the end of the day, a better agricultural sector ensures that Kenya is better in general. Proudly opening governments.
Thank you to the Prime Minister. Call upon the Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, that was 7 minutes of my life I'll never get back. Let me start by framing this debate back to our side and showing you why opening opposition deserves to win this debate. There are three important burdens, which is number one, to reflect on the decision for banning insignificance. Number two, weighing in on the harms or benefits of GMOs. And thirdly, to provide a stakeholder analysis. None of which you got from opening bench. But let me engage them either ways, right? So number one, they talked about the fact that when you're going to just change a certain bit of these crops, and cassava will still remain cassava. Mr. Speaker, you as a human have 23 chromosomes that make you either a male or a female. If you change one chromosome, right, this is what causes people to have sickle cell anemia. This is what causes people to have different genders. This is to say that when you change a specific DNA, right, in that DNA strand, this will inevitably affect even the amount of nutrients that you get from these fruits or from these vegetables. Either way, you're changing something for the benefit of the other. Why do we think that genetically modified crops are being produced in the first place? This is because of business and not because of the benefit of the people. We feel that opening government or governance bench is for the case of providing more business to governments and corporates, and making sure that the farmers, who are the most important stakeholder in today's debate, and the majority who are contributing to the majority of the economies in these countries, are the ones that are suffering the most. Secondly, she talked about DNA. This is very inexpensive, right? But we get an engagement from CO already telling you, right, that the fact that because of the large scale of this thing, right, you cannot talk of the idea of it being inexpensive. But secondly, the motion in itself tells us about the importation of genetically modified crops. This removes everything she talks about Kenya being able to produce its own genetically modified crops, because she's debating something that the motion doesn't cater for. But secondly, the reason why this is it in the first place is because African countries initially do not have the technology for producing this at the scale in which we can commercialize this and sell it to these other countries, so that doesn't exist. But thirdly, she talks about all East African countries suffering drought. Ladies and gentlemen, in May 2015, when Kenya was suffering and needing maize, right, Tanzania had actually subsidized the amount of money through the East African community and sent maize to cater for the drought that had happened in Kenya. But secondly, when Tanzania was, especially specifically Dar es Salaam, was going through a drought and were not able to access water through our taps, Bukoba, which is next to Uganda, was actually benefiting from Lake Victoria, which is catered for by those East African communities. This is to say, right, that this idea of the fact that all East African communities cannot produce maize just because Kenya is not producing maize is a fallacy. Different agricultural areas live in different geological areas, and that necessarily means that just because one country, one area for that sake is going through a drought, doesn't mean that every other is going through a drought. I'm going to necessarily engage, I'll take you later, engage on an issue of why we think that genetically modified crops are necessarily bad for Kenya, and why we support the ban, right? Number one, we talk about the environmental impacts, right? So we know about genetically modified organisms, right? And how they or genetically modified crops, and how these chemicals, right? We're talking about not only the seeds that you're planting, right? But even the fertilizers that you're going to use to these crops. We think that this is necessarily going to inevitably affect the soil structure and the soil fertility and the soil quality, which is going to affect us even if we're going to produce our own plants. So I'll take you.
So you are telling lies. When you use GMOs, you don't even use chemicals for these plants anymore, because you don't need fertilizers. These are things that are happening in the lab, not in the soil. Why?
Ladies and gentlemen, right? Genetically modified, right? Everything that we look at, everything that is living, right, has genetics more or less, right? So we're not only talking about the plants that you're going to look, right? You're talking about organic fertilizers, right? Don't these have genomes in themselves? If you're talking about genetically modified, you're not only referring to crops, so please don't be so small-sighted opening government, right? Secondly, on the issue of scientifics, right, I've already proved to you how the genome structure or changing genome structures automatically affect the quality or the output of the amount of crops that you actually get, right? But thirdly, we think it's a moral responsibility of government to actually cater for the majority of the citizens. We believe in this instance, the farmers are the ones who are losing out in market share if we're going to be importing crops, genetically modified crops. One thing that genetically modified crops, right, provide is the fact that you can plant a plant today and then you get it tomorrow. But what quality of nutrients that are you actually getting out of that crop, right? You're just going to sell it and you're going to get money. But who's going to lose out at the end of the day? We think that the farmers who are actually planting these local crops are going to lose out at the end of the day because they're losing out in market share. And we believe that these farmers are so important because they are the largest taxpayers. We look at, for example, in most East African countries, where over 70% of these economies are built by the agricultural sector. These are the main people that are losing out. What are we providing on the counterfactual to solve that issue of food security? We're telling you, number one, the importation or the injection of food from the East African communities, right? We've already proved to you how EAC has done that to Tanzania in 2015. But secondly, we feel that there's an importance for subsidizing local farmers or subsidizing the produce or the amount of subsidizing the costs for local farmers to ensure that they're able to make sure that since there's an increase in droughts, they're able to easily provide their businesses or do their businesses effectively. But thirdly, we tell you about grain stores, right? We think that even if a country is going through a drought, most countries, right, have grain stores that actually store it to actually cater for the issues of drought, right? So which means that you could still produce your produce locally and still benefit on the grain stores without making sure that you completely don't go out, right? So if we keep the ban, we're ensuring increased national produce, right, and a chance for local farmers to grow the local produce, but also increasing the innovations towards practices and not necessarily the crops that OG is telling you about, right? We think innovation is very important and is actually required for African nations in order to diversify our economies. But secondly, we're telling you about the increase in regional trade. Before this decision was made, since the establishment of the Common Protocol, there's been an increase in intra-African trade to the EAC protocols, and we believe that importation will not allow us to export our produce, which will significantly affect our economy as an East African nation and Africa as a large. With that, I rest.
Thank you to the Leader of the Opposition. Call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Great. In 2020, we all had a horrible year. But people in East Africa, Kenya included, they not only had to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, but they also had to deal with the low-cost infestation. The changing global weather patterns has caused a situation where insects that are not supposed to move at a particular time are moving. Rain that is supposed to fall at a particular time is not falling. Therefore, there needs to be an alternative for these states to be able to sustain their people and to sustain the society. What I am not clear about in the entire open opposition case is why the state would want to cause mass genocide. Because all the alternatives they argue in this debate would still be done by the state. So if the state is such a horrible actor, we can't have a debate in this room at all because the state would end up fucking everything else. If you believe that the state can equally allow things like exporting food from Eastern Africa, I'm not quite sure why you think that same state would then let people eat food from crops that are poisonous and food from crops that would kill them. It makes no logical sense. Like this debate is not about the state will not be able to do it, the state will kill its people. The debate is about there are a couple of alternatives. This is the alternative that the Kenyan government has given, and this is why we support it, or this is why we don't support it. All those other cases on like the very funny mechanisms that they talk about do not matter. GMO exists. Countries like the United States of America, Canada use it. Ghana, we have it. The Ghana Atomic Energy Commission has the radioactive parts, I'm coming, that allows people to like create GMOs internally. What that then means is that people are doing it. Their conversation about, people are going to die makes no sense because I'm alive and I know I've eaten some GMO food in the past. That's not how it works. All of these things are out. Before I start the rest of my case, yes.
What do you see when you import GMOs for the next 25 years? What do you
okay. So this is the problem, right? Your response to the debate is not something that does not include importation. So I'm not quite sure why you're making importation look bad. The nuance in this debate then becomes what kind of importation is happening. And this is where we win the debate, because OO is being disingenuous. What does it mean to import GMO crops? And that is what the debate is about, not GMO food. There's a difference between GMO-produced food, like some food that you buy in the supermarket that was done based on GMO produce, etc., that is being imported to your country after it's a finished good. But then there are crops, which are like seeds, like things that you need to plant in your own country in order to produce food in your own country. So in this debate, we are not importing finished food from the United States of America that were done using GMO crops. In this debate, we are importing seeds. We are importing whatever it is that you need to plant food. That is what this debate is about. I'm not quite sure why in their world we need to rather import food that has already been planted in other East African countries, that has already been processed in other East African countries, and then it's being brought here. But also recognize this is a very bad alternative because we've already explained to you how the geographical landscape of East Africa is changing. Therefore, all of these other alternatives that you talk about are not such amazing alternatives because, yes, they may have sent you maize a couple of years ago, but it is not sustainable insofar as all of these countries are equally suffering from the same kinds of problem in terms of climate change, pest infestation, etc. They need to defend why that particular narrative or that particular alternative that they provide in this debate makes any sense, especially after we have been able to clarify the issues that exist. CEO.
Yes, so with the kind of hunger you talk about, you have to be reasonable to assume that you cannot all of a sudden grow all those crops because you said they are not that fast to grow. What it means is importation of finished goods have to happen, else the Kenyan people...
Yeah, but I'm not quite sure what your debate is about because recognize that in our world, we are starting something that helps us deal with the problem. In your world, you say, oh, because it's going to take a long period, let's not deal with the problem at all. Let's just continue to import. It makes absolutely no sense. But the whole conversation about importation of finished food is a very bad argument, especially when you consider the people that live in Kenya and the kind of demographics that exist. Recognize that we've seen a lot of countries in Central Africa, Eastern Africa, see droughts that have caused people to have so many issues. We've seen Somalia, we've seen Eritrea. All of these things are examples of what happens when the state does not stamp its feet on the ground and deal with these issues like immediately, right? A couple of things that could come up in the closing half of this debate or from DLO, that there are cultural problems that would cause people not want to eat this food. Panel, there were cultural problems when books were invented. People said books were going to create a situation where people were never going to talk to each other. People talk about how the mobile phone has changed society, but because of the utility, people continue to eat it. All of these things are things that can be solved insofar as you are providing the food for the people, and these people are hungry and recognize that this particular produce is less expensive. Let me explain the conversation about less expensive and how it solves the problem, because I don't want anyone to screw OG in this debate, right? What then does this mean? What happens is that with GMO crops, we are able to produce a larger amount of food because of the fact that we don't end up having a situation where pests are going to cause problems, but secondly, cost of producing food reduces significantly. So even if the entire opposition bench in this debate is going to argue that the initial cost is extremely expensive, we say it is a bullet we are ready to take, because at the end of the day, in the long term, the cost then reduces because you're not spending a lot of money on fertilizers. Recognize these fertilizers are not produced in Kenya and most of African countries. They are being imported. You're not spending a lot of money on chemicals, and pests can't screw you up. But also recognize, because of these modifications, these particular food crops are things that can be stored for a longer period as compared to their completely natural counterparts. What this then also means is that long term, we are able to store more food, have less produce going to waste in few instances where we get a bounty harvest, right? What that then means is that at the end of the day, we save a lot of cost. But other things that we could also equally hear in this particular debate is a conversation about how these particular crops are going to put us in the hands of the West. Panel, recognize that, yes, at the beginning, these technologies will be imported. The only way we are able to build on research and begin to do these things on our own is when we are able to take these technologies and bring them into our own countries. None of the technologies that exist in status quo, where most of them were not invented in Africa, that never stopped us from using these technologies. That can't be an argument that there'll be Western control because they give you GMOs. I've already explained to you that Ghana is doing it. A couple of other African countries are doing it. That argumentation on Western imperialism, Western control is something that is so old and shouldn't exist in this debate. At the end of the day, we are the only side that ensures that the mandate of the state to provide for the people, to give these people jobs, is something that is important. Farmers are not going to suffer because farmers are still going to be the ones planting these things. The crops are not going to grow in just one day. That's just ridiculous. It's not magic. But finally, the government will not become a farmer all of a sudden. The people who are farmers are still going to farm and do these things. They help the farmers at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister. Call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition here.
hope I'm audible enough. I hope I'm audible enough. Thank you. Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, Mr. Speaker, the main problem with OG is that they think the lie that they're persisting in today's debate is going to make them win. I come from a poultry business. We mainly poultry 2 types of chickens, right? A local chicken and the hybrid chicken, which comes from a genetically modified like DNA, right? And the problem is that a genetically modified chicken deserves more care. It needs vaccines. It needs a certain type of care if you want high volumes of chicken from them, right? Genetically modified crops don't come as some of like a cheap options to get crops in Kenya. It is a business-oriented crop. You need to take care of it to get large tons of, for example, maize to ensure that people in Kenya get food security. So the problem here is you have to understand that the option that OG is presenting to you is not a cheaper option that is good for the majority of Kenyan farmers, right? So here we look at who's marginalized in the society and how are we protecting them. We think this is the burden that he failed to commit from the first speech, right? So secondly, we also need to understand if 60% of like the Kenyan economy is supported by agriculture, and agriculture is mainly done by people who come from rural areas where villages depend on them to feed, we feel like if we replace this with GMOs, that is going to be done by some Chinese subsidy in Naivasha, who's going to really be able to farm these crops, we think who are really benefiting is not those marginalized Kenyans who live in the rural areas and depend on agriculture to feed these villages. We think the most important people in today's debate are the ones who are completely disadvantaged in OG's world, right? So there are 2 worlds in today's motion, right? A world where we choose to import GMOs that are going to be farmed by some Chinese subsidy, or number 2, we choose a world where the government focuses on investing or subsidizing farmers in Kenya by sustainable agricultural mechanisms that can enhance a sustainable food security, which does not come by sacrificing our autonomy and sovereignty through having balance of payments that are very unfavorable just because we depend on this importation to rely on a very important thing like food security. We think that's where the first problem exists, right? And that's how OO fails in today's debate, because they also fail to commit on 3 main burdens, right? They fail to commit in a burden of why is it important to create a dependency on a very crucial thing like food security, right? But 2, why is it okay to rule out the backbone of the majority of the marginalized farmers who actually feed these villages? That's the second burden that they fail to commit to. But thirdly, why are you sacrificing investing in sustainable structures to invest in proper import mechanisms that are going to favor those few Chinese? And we think this is the most crucial part of OG's case, which does not make them stand. We expect more from CG, right? So this is what we tell you from our first speech. We tell you that the only way we are going to sustain and evolve in production of GMOs is if we invest in structures that enhance like an Africanacity improvement in economies, right? We tell you this. It is important to ban GMOs because we get mainly one thing, right? That comes exclusively from my speech, other than the benefits that comes from the first speech, right? We get a sustainable, favorable balance of payments in 2 ways, right? In a way that we are protecting the economy in the long run, in a way that we are going to enhance organically farmed crops, which really are the virtues that represent the food from Kenya, and protect these farmers who actually farm these organic crops, who we think are the most important part of this motion, right? We think food security is the most important thing we should rely on. We don't want to see Kenya ending up a country like Southern Sudan, which the government promised people that if we're going to rely on importation of certain crops in a certain period of time, we're going to have food security in a certain period of time. We all know how the nature of how our government structures are like created, right? We think our government structures do not give them the proper incentive to ensure that the promises that they give these people are the promises that are going to be fulfilled, right? And this history has proved to us, right? So in Southern Sudan, when they are around food security, the dependency of food security rised from 12% and now it's 42%. God knows how it's going to be in 20 years. And this is because the government made the promise that OG is creating in today's debate to rely on importation on crops that are going to be favored to plant by only some Chinese company, right? We think that is something that we should not lie in today's debate. We think we need to focus this debate on those organically made crops. Yes?
So you recognize that the issues that we are dealing with are unnatural. Therefore, even if you subsidize things for local farmers, the low cost will still mess it up. How do you deal with those issues?
No. I think we need to go back to our agriculture class, right? If you invest in proper agriculture mechanisms like irrigation, like proper schemes that enhance agriculture, you don't depend on weather or seasons to food crops, right? You don't depend on rain. We think that point does not stand because when you talk about not technologically advanced, but proper advanced mechanisms that the government can afford to give these farmers. We're talking about systems that are going to be sustainable in the end of the day. We're building an economy that comes from an organically grown government. We think this is the most important part of this debate, right? We think instead the government should also try to strengthen cooperatives that tend to give loans to these farmers, cooperatives that tends to enhance the union that exists between these farmers. We think these are the types of initiatives in a policy motion like this should persist in order to create a state where individuals are going to be benefited in the end of the day, right? We think we also need to invest in sustainable systems like building wells and stuff of that nature in rural areas. And these are the promises I think the government should start focusing on and not starting creating options that can give them a leeway to end up like a country like Southern Sudan. We think this is the instances that you're trying to avoid, and if we stand to OG's case, we think this is where we're going to end up when we think this is not a part of the debate we're going to stand, right? So we think the autonomy and the sovereignty that in the end of the day African countries are supposed to have is what is crucial in today's debate, right? The autonomy and sovereignty to debate against a wholly created economy through individual efforts of citizens, through the foundations that the government puts to them, I think is what should mainly be prioritized if we want to quickly win this debate, right? So a quick stakeholder analysis, right? So number one, we think the people who benefit better in the world of OO is those people who the government are going to subsidize. We're talking about the farmers who live their life to know how they can make their farmings better. And we think even in those small Kenyan companies that want to enhance themselves in technologized agricultural forms, we think these companies are crucial. We have people graduating from agricultural universities who have better forms of mechanisms, but they just don't have well-invested structures from the government to enhance them to practice technologized agriculture that is going to give sustainable growth in Kenya. We think these are the things that we should focus on, right? So in terms of how people are going to benefit the society, the marginalized, we think we get a better world in OO, right? We think the government also fulfills what it has for its people if we go with what OO's case is saying, right? But at a case where we want to favor corporates and favor a capitalistic system that is going to shackle individuals, we think that's when we go with OG, and we think that's not the world that we want. I think CG should come with a better case to counteract that. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Call upon the Member for the Government. Here.
Okay, just want to confirm I'm audible. Phenomenal. So I was starting. Okay, just to clarify one thing. We think that there is actually some credit to what OO says. We think that this debate doesn't work if GMOs don't have some flaws, because it's illogical to expect OP to defend the banning of something that was perfectly good from day one. And the science just simply adds up. The way GMOs are designed, they are designed to increase productivity. The problem is that if you are trying to increase productivity with the same amount of crop, you are taking a lot more from the soil, and that's obviously going to have an impact. We agree, GMOs are bad. We're going to explain in very clear terms why no matter how terrible GMOs might be, they are legitimate and they should exist. No. So this is what we're going to do on these terms here. One, we're going to show you the context that exists in today's debate, and that context and how it responds to what comes out of open opposition. The first bit of context that exists in today's debate is simple. Is that the UN has already permitted or predicted a global food crisis coming in 2023, going all the way to 2025, and possibly beyond that. Why? First and foremost, right, COVID broke down supply chains so badly that transporting food is ridiculously hard, ridiculously difficult, and there is consistent contentions above which goods to transport over a very large scale. And the problem with food when you ship it in cabotage is this, right? Is that 1 ton of Irish potatoes is probably worth $1,000. A ton of Nike shoes is worth a few million. So they take priority of luxury goods over moving food, which means it's really hard to move food around right now in status quo. The second thing is this, right, is that people were locked at home during COVID, which means they didn't produce a lot. The outcome of them being locked at home during COVID and not producing anything was that, there's obviously less food. The third thing that causes this is that there's currently a war in Ukraine, the food basket of the world, which means people are also not going to farm, and the existing crops are consistently being destroyed by Russian bombs. Finally, because of the COVID existence within that assistance, people have already dipped into their stores and their reserves, so it's already well spent. So there is an incoming global food crisis that predicts that the greater amount of poor people in the world will die. Guess where poor people live? Africa. Guess where Kenya is? Africa. So what that means is simple, right? Is that there is a need for food that must be serviced and must be responded to in this particular scenario. Why can't smuggling and why can't transporting from other East African countries fix this problem? Two reasons. One is that other East African countries are fairly likely to experience the same issues too, because they've also dipped into their funds. So even if they are developing or producing, they're not producing enough to export consistently at the point in time where that food crisis happens. Second of all, other countries demand this food and have more financial power than you. They're probably going to pay a lot more than Kenya to get that food, especially when it comes to organic food. So inevitably, you're going to have a seriously large problem in getting that from other East African countries. We think that itself is bad. But the next thing you need to understand is that why can't mechanization or opting your agricultural standard work? Because that's a long-term project, panel. When India wanted to up their agricultural project and inevitably create economic policies and systems and structures to allow them to create food, right? They invested billions of dollars over decades. And even till now, there are still flaws in that system, regardless of how well thought out it was. So if you're going to do that to save people from dying from a drought that is coming in literally a few months, and starvation that's coming in literally a few months, you're probably not likely to succeed. There is an existent problem on ground that needs quick action, quick replies, and quick engagement. Why do we think we're able to solve this problem? One is that as bad as GMOs are, and let's concede to the fact that they might in fact be even harmful and cause cancer. Panel, cancer is a long-term disease and probably kills you 20 years later. Starvation is a now disease, a now problem that kills you now and inevitably screws you over. The problem that you need to engage here is simple, is that at the point in time where you have to deal with a world of no food, do you end up eating shitty food, or you choose to be bougie and you starve to death? We think that logically makes no sense. We think it doesn't stand in today's debate and it cannot be legitimized on any stance. But finally on the idea of farmers and local farmers being screwed over. When you have scarcity, right, local farmers are very unlikely to be screwed over, because even if you import, there will probably still likely be scarcity, because Kenya, as I said before, has limited financial means, right? So that means that farmers will still have demand for their goods, and local farmers are not getting kicked out of the market regardless. What that means is this, right? Sadly, you're out. But most importantly, how do we outweigh opening government? We think we outweigh opening government, one, using the context that responds to the cases. Because at the point where the comparative still exists from opening half, OO is actually winning, because they give multiple alternatives in a realistic world that shows that GMOs probably have some flaws. At that comparative, OG loses. We are the team that settles that comparative by explaining in very clear terms, one, why those mechanisms don't work on upbench by giving those responses, but finally showing what the way up really is in the debate. But yeah, your POI.
Within the same context of UN calling food shortage, the World Food Programme still encourages organic food consumption, and Africa is in a better position. So for the same amount of money, we believe that we should prepare ourselves where we are able to market and be the producers of organic food.
Okay, as I explained before, that's a 1 decade plan minimum, and this is a 2-year problem. I think you need to think that case through. But we move on. But the most clear thing to actually explain to this debate is that this comparative, we are winning. But let's put an extra step to ensure that we get this win. Why exactly is starvation bad? Panel, the process through which starvation happens is this, right? It targets the most vulnerable members of society, the poor people, the people that governments themselves are obligated to protect. But most importantly, right, there is almost no objective solution to starvation when it happens. It's not something you can cure with drugs, or you can simply throw money at the point in which it happens. You need to make adequate preparations for it and solve those problems really well ahead of time. The reason why, if you open your trade systems to engage in these solutions, is that at the point in which you open it up, you prepare ahead of time and you ensure that these things don't happen. But panel, a second extension, just so this is clear, right, is that at the point in time where we think GMOs might in fact be problematic, when you have an incoming chaos or incoming crisis, we think human beings, local citizens, should get the right and the freedom to choose how that crisis is solved. When you ban GMOs or you maintain the ban on GMOs, you don't give them that freedom of choice. Or you give them at very high prices of food that they probably cannot afford and have to work hard to do. If you think organic food is relevant, organic food is good, inform people about how valuable organic food is and let them choose between expensive organic food or cheap food that they can actually afford to feed. We think a better world is a world in which people actually have the choice to make these decisions. As Kojo rightly points out in his POI, World Food Programme already encourages these things and tells people about how great organic food is. So people probably know that organic food is good. So at the point in which they are making these decisions, they are making rational and fairly informed choices. So we think that we should let them make these choices because people deserve the right to make a choice. It's a fundamental part of human dignity. So at the point in time where we allow people make choices, we prevent a massive starvation from happening, we save a bunch of lives, and we finally explain why short-term solutions are needed, and primarily why this doesn't harm farmers. We're very proud to win today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you to the member for the government. Call upon the member for the opposition. Here.
Am I audible? Okay, great. IAFA says when there is a crisis, you give citizens the right to choose their methods of handling the crisis. The problem is that in October, William Ruto made this decision unitarily. People did not vote on those policies. It wasn't one of the things that concerned William Ruto's campaign message. In fact, his campaign message was to make sure that local farmers gain more than what Kenyatta was given, such that they are able to monetize better, because in Kenya, most of the lands are not even given to these farmers at good rates, because most of it is enshrined in elitist property. And so one of his first policies was to make sure that he further subsidized these fertilizers. Realize these fertilizers are there, but they are expensive, so the farmers cannot buy them. What he did was to subsidize it to make sure that these things exist. What it means is, it is in principle self-sabotage to now say that you are going to dilute an industry that you swore on oath as president to protect. What it means is that on principle, we cannot support this because it is a very undemocratic act and reeks into previous Kenyan stories of the government being in bed with foreign actors. On democracy, we win. Secondly, we think that OG had to be more realistic in today's debate. Because if UN says there will be hunger, why will UN say don't use GMOs? Because it means that there's an urgency and risk that cannot be taken. Because if GMOs could produce more, they'll just say there is hunger, so everybody should genetically modify their food and feed everybody in the world. Because it's not as simplistic as cancer. Realize, common diseases like malaria kill millions of people in Africa. You don't really need cancer. What it means is GMOs, one, have inconclusive research about their harms. That's why many countries are afraid. So it's wrong for them to say that research was a lie. It's inconclusive. What it means is that there are a lot of health risks that are not explored yet. That is why countries shy away from it. We think that on that way up, we win. At least CG was more realistic to concede the harms. We say that third, the info slide gives a specific context, i.e. importation of crops. You cannot lie as OG that you are going to produce those crops yourself. But even if they do, here is the way up and why we win. One, Kenya receives a lot of international support because they moved into recycling and green energy. That's why you don't even see a lot of plastic around Kenya. This has helped them gain a lot of funds and public support. Two, their movement towards organic food, which you got from Kojo's POI, being the new trend, gains more. One, because organic food is more expensive than GMOs. What it means is they better monetize these things. Two, you cannot export GMOs because it's against UN policy. One, but you cannot tell me that Kenya can give you better GMOs than UK and US. Those guys have dominated that market. What it means is that the niche to be able to gain that economies of scale exists specifically in the organic market. On that, we think that we still win. But the problem, and that's how I weigh over OO. OO says, well, the farmers pay so much tax, and yes, we think they do. But the problem is this. When farmers are supposed to compete with international actors, let's even say they have people here. One, you don't just produce these things, right? You need it in large scales. What it means to a very large extent is that these farmers are not able to monetize as much as people who have advanced agricultural companies, who have labs can do. You can't tell me that a farmer in a village somewhere is able to go to a lab and do DNA replication, right? It's really unclear how OG wins the debate. But panel, here is how the debate gets interesting. And this is why CEO wins. The debate exists in a context of drought. To keep it simple, they don't have water. There is no rain. So even if your crops can withstand insects, they don't have water to grow. And so what it means is that until the water problem is solved, all your GMOs with their Iron Man resistance are not going to grow because plants need water to grow. Like, this is basic natural science. I think I do better at this. What it means, panel, is that they needed to show the correlation between a lack of water and a production and the promotion of food growth in a world where water is limited. Because if you do not promote the access to water, these farmers will have their seeds that can resist insects, but they do not have water. What it means is this: one, you condemn those farmers. Why? Because people will always go for the cheaper things, not because they want, but that's what they can afford. Secondly, the long-standing irrigation problem in Africa, that is, we depending on rain most of the time, will never be solved. Because the reason people are so concerned about those irrigation methods is that is the only way we can get good food to eat. If you are able to show them that they can get food without solving the water problem, i.e. importing GMOs, you reduce the urgency on these things. But we don't think that water is even used only for farming. No, those people need it for sustenance, like drinking, like livestock and things like that. What it means is the water problem kills more than starvation. Let's take OG.
So, in your world, I guess you are going to build a big use. But secondly, with mobile phones and all other forms of technology, the impact may be inconclusive, but we need them now. Engage.
Like panel, you see, that's the problem with teams. They are always ridiculous when it comes to others' cases. You don't need to build a new sea. Nobody does that. Irrigation system. Let me explain irrigation system. So you need things like pipe. It's made of something called PVC, right? So you need pipes that connect literally other water bodies in other parts of Africa. 2, Egypt is even using irrigation system in desert areas to be able to connect water from other parts of Africa. 3, Libya was able to commercialize farming by the importation of water. We think that the cost is high, like Ayafa said, but what it means is that because, like we said, organic marketing is a niche market. What it means is people are craving for it because 1, it's truthfully more healthier. 2, I have an edge over my friends when I tell them I eat organic because I feel healthier. What it means is people like to hop on the trend. 3, international market regulations supports these countries, like giving them organic food grants to be able to make sure that they can grow more. And that's why Kenya is very relevant, because they are one of the most environmentally friendly nations in Africa. What you do when you support government's world is that you reduce the overall uniqueness of Kenya as a market center in Africa, because they literally would be doing everything that everybody does. And even on GMOs, South Africa beats them because South Africa is able to produce more. We say that for Kenya to still be the eye and horn of Africa, it has to be unique and not like everybody else. Proud CEO.
Thank you to the member for the opposition. Call upon the government whip. Hear, hear.
Just a second.
Panel, we think today's debate is more important than these guys paint it, right? Because they assume, oh, we live in a situation where we have options and we have alternatives that we can actually run. We think that's not the idea in today's debate. We need to critically look at the concepts and what actually backs the idea of today's debate. First, the idea of GMO. This is something Ayafa gives you. No response to this was actually, sophisticated enough to take out this case. The idea of GMO is one that these guys do not necessarily give you the research or the technological information that help you actually expand GMO within within your space, right? So these guys say, oh, we think that, Kenya should actually even bring these things within themselves and expand within their space. They don't give you those things, right? They keep and reserve it within themselves. That is the most expensive part of GMO. What they give you is actually, crops that are just basic for food expansion, and we think this is very, very much important in today's debate. Finally, the next thing is the idea of today's debate and, how it actually should run. The idea of global food crisis predicted by the UN first, this is something that IAFA gives you, and very, very much important in today's debate. The economic crisis that currently exists as a result of COVID. Two things. First of all, sit down. First of all, we think that this is actually something that happens on the supply of food from countries like Ukraine, countries like Kenya. It means one thing, that the idea is countries will always prioritize their own countries in situations where food becomes a problem. Because these guys say, oh, Tanzania goes ahead to help Kenya, but that's the normal situation, right? But in cases where they are extreme, right, we don't think that countries are going to, prioritize your food, crisis over theirs, right? We think this is very, very more important. These guys don't engage to this debate. Notice that during the Cold War, right, it's very, very much impossible for countries to trade essential goods that they actually need to keep for themselves, right? Because the comparative is, what do we need at that particular point in time? These guys will not prioritize, trying to make proceeds over exports than, trying to solve the hunger that will actually rise as a result of this. We do not operate on normal situations. We're talking about a food drought. Very, very much proud to win from CG. The next thing to do is to give a clear distinction between upbench, because we think OO is automatically, last in today's debate, because this guy is actually, just engaged in this debate as if we're not talking about, a crisis, right? Our comparison, we think that the realistic world outside the space of food insecurity, we think that OO points out really calm ideas about, how government must prioritize local agricultural production and screw imports, right? This is good. By way of comparison between this and YAF's sophistication is that we think that the more important thing is to ask the question of what actually exists presently. The idea of, the global crisis and what, countries need to do presently as it stands now, right? This is the idea of today's debate. But if you move to CG, right? If you move to CO, is the idea about William Ruto actually doing this without the idea of people's choice and all of that, right? We think it's an elected official, and we think that it still falls within his mandate, right? And this only increases the existing options, right? But we think that what is more important is that government role in fulfilling its responsibility. A government is not an average reasonable voter, right? This is very important in today's debate. Why is this important? Because what an average person who is privileged living in a Western, liberal society where they have liberty to choose between GMOs and natural products, they have liberty to morally, condemn things like GMOs. But in today's world, we don't have that luxury, right? Let's look at the idea of agency and command theory, where government has the duty and responsibility for a population to provide for them essential services, right? Where the fundamental objectives, and direct state principles and policies mandate government to ensure that economic objectives are met, which means that provide individuals the right of assurance, right? We think that the government role of funding, you disturb me, I'll take you.
Even if lifting the ban may try to solve the problem in the short term, CG still doesn't prove how the solution is relevant in the long term. The harms still proposed by OO are still relevant, and significance is the key. Secondly, food crises are never...
Sit down.
One's need is one's access.
All right, sit down. Panel, I'll come back to your case. These guys, the next thing CG tells you that organic market is a niche and Kenya can dominate. Panel, this is a long-term project, and we think starvation and people dying is actually a noun thing, right? We need to prioritize one, and that is why today's debate is important. Panel, weigh the sophistication you get from IAFA's piece of material and compare it to the feeble arguments you get from these guys. The next thing they tell you is that, see, there's no water and, drought becomes a problem. Notice how all their problems are actually solved within the space of GMO. Very much consistent, because GMO actually gives you, the idea or the option of drought-resistant crops, right? They still exist within status quo. What these guys tell you is the weak knowledge of what GMO looks like and what they actually think it should run in today's debate. Panel, if organic goods are so good, right? We think that people will still, choose organic goods over GMOs, right? But the critical condition that exists that shapes the idea behind this choice is one that they are less likely going to find organic goods as a result of that problem that will actually arise. There's a distance to where today's debate is going to. That distance is where, they actually need to prioritize a world where there's a choice between, dying after eating GMO because we consider, okay, GMO is bad, which is actually a long-term thing and you might not even die in the first instance, or dying out of starvation because hunger is a noun thing. That is actually where today's debate exists. These guys don't engage that word. I'll take CG. I'll take you.
They still don't compare the impact, because what we say is water is just beyond food. You say it's resistant to insects.
Sit down. Panel, their biggest problem is impact. It means they have another problem, English. The idea is, IAFA tells you, see, the impact in today's debate is life, right? And we are talking, or we are comparing a word of longevity and a noun thing, right? Because the idea is, if your impact is in the long term, these guys, the way they talk about is to prioritize, local agricultural farmers and all of those things. That's not our business, right? Because the idea is, where is today's debate headed? Today's debate is headed in a world where people need to make two choices, right? A choice where, okay, even if we consider GMOs are bad, eat GMO and survive, and maybe even if you die later on. But in a world where, you say you want to prioritize, choosing local goods or choosing, organic foods, where you don't even have that option in the first instance. This is not a comparison between, what is good for GMO or what is not, a comparison whether GMO is better than organic food. Notice why this comparison is very, very much important. We'll not argue whether GMOs are actually very, very much better than organic food in status quo. The question is, at that point where you don't have the luxury of options, we think that government is still, legitimized to do crazy things like that. Government does not necessarily need to be rational. That's why governments are legitimate to give arms to citizens who are not even trained within military to move into the war front and start shooting guns and get killed, right? Because we think it's very consistent within their mandate to protect states and provide for these people. But in the case of food security, we think it's also very, very much consistent. We've shown you the burden of how today's debate exists to put us between two choices: eat or survive, and die later. That's even if you get to die, or die now because you don't want to eat GMOs because GMOs are harmful. Engage today's debate as to why that option is not necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all teams for participating in the debate. I invite you to... Apologies, long day. Thank you to the government whip. I'd like to call upon the opposition whip. Apologies, here. My apologies again to the opposition whip speaker. We do want to hear your speech.
In 3, 2, 1. For the same incentives of food security call etc., and for the same amount of money being used to i.e. food security calls, and for the same amount of money being used to prepare Africa for this crisis, CEO says that we should keep on depending and surrendering to Western powers. We say that we should use that to prepare ourselves, and Kenya is in the best position to be able to lead this. And this is important for this reason. In almost all of the global crises, African states have been left helpless and are always at the mercy of Western powers because we make a lot of investment in Western solutions as opposed to looking internally and finding indigenous solutions that are niche and that we can help to spread for ourselves and us. That's the long-term impact we prove to you from closing government, and we think that we better prepare African states and Kenya for this particular crisis. I'll just engage the chat on food security because it runs across the bench, right? So what are the impacts of food security you get from this bench? 3 impacts. 1, when these things are able to be stored. 2, there is mass production. And 3, there is more food you're able to export these things. Here are several responses. I think, first of all, the West is already far ahead of, for us, within this particular economy. And so it means that they have the facility, they have the engagement, they already have large market share, and they're already selling these things. So they don't explain why we'll be able to compete with them and be able to sell as much as they are selling, right? But the second response is that because they have better systems, it's very, very difficult for you, an African country, to be able to catch up within these systems and be able to get the huge amount of impacts that they are happening. It is true, the impacts that are existent on their side are impacts that are existing in Western countries that have been able to do these things for a longer period of time. It is unclear how African states who are about to enter this particular market, especially when they are still depending on these people that are far ahead of us, will be able to get the impact that CEO talks about, or CG talks about in today's debate. But this is even more important because even in instances where African states have unique items like cocoa, unique items like wood and everything, they are still not able to dominate these particular markets because of the structures that you get from the members' extension. Things like international laws that are unfair to them for them to be able to market their goods. Things like unfair sanctions that are placed on them for every move that they want to take. It's really, really unclear how their impacts happen to the large scale that these guys preach to you. They have very, very little impact. You cannot credit them on that particular ground. But what is CEO's unique extension? CEO's unique extension is that this is very, very urgent. The first thing is that GMOs, do not equally fit like into the urgency, because you still need to engage in deals to find like a supplier who's going to supply you the GMOs for you to grow. It still takes a long time to grow, etc. So it means that there's equally like some time on their end. They don't solve it in a day or two. They equally takes much more time to be able to do these things. But what do you get in addressing the urgency specifically from these guys? All do not contribute to the chat on urgency. But what do you specifically get to you? We argue that there are more urgent problems like in agriculture system that prevents us from being prepared, right? So issues like irrigation issues, which all the teams concede is a problem in today's debate. Secondly, issues like lack of storage mechanisms, etc. We say that for the same amount of money being used to go for these particular GMOs, where you are not going to be competitive as these guys assume, use these things to solve these particular pertinent problems. Because the issue is, even if you agree to them, if you grow the crops, you still not. If you grow the crops, it means that you still now have storage systems to be able to store them. So in as much as they could last for so many days, you still have storage systems, and so you don't get their impasse. We engage the issue of urgency insofar as we are able to fix these things. But the reason why it's more important and we are able to make the deadline is because of items like AFTA, because of items like the Eastern Confederation, like formulating these policies that allows for things like sharing of technology among African states, that allow for things like using like other like free labor for you to get people to be able to indulge in these things. And so we prove that on the matter of urgency, CEO proved to you that you are most likely able to do these things on our side. But this is the long-term impact and why we win in that particular regard. And the long-term impact, because for this particular drought crisis, we have been able to focus on our indigenous technology and now be able to withstand these things like better irrigation and better systems. It means that on our side, we are cut off from like the Western, and we do not have to go back to them to go and cry for more GMOs in that particular regard. But just like we are crying for more vaccines, right? Because of things like vaccine politics and how they use these things to perpetuate software, it's really unclear how when you are dependent on them, they are going to give this to you in the time where the crisis eventually happens. CEO says that differentiate yourself from them, look internally, fix your own agricultural problems, and that's the only way in the long-term impact you'll be able to be free. These guys need to defend the world where in the long term, when we are still dependent on them, calling for more GMOs from them, they wouldn't do it like they are doing vaccines. That's a very, very terrible plan for African states. Now let me engage OG uniquely before that POI.
So here's the problem. Your entire case is dependent on importation. You equally don't have those pipes, those expertise like you claim you don't. So you're going to import the things that will be needed to create the new sea and river that you want to do. But secondly, the biggest...
Thank you, sit down please. So the point is this, these solutions are ones that are being explored in status quo. Countries are doing this. But the point is this, we think that we should invest more into this because of the urgency that CEO talks about. So in the context of urgency, we need to be able to get more of this, because in status quo, we are doing few of these things and want to depend on GMOs. That particular dependency is bad. So for the same amount of money, scale up whatever that you are doing to scale up your issues. But the second thing is that the kind of context within which they are doing these things in the status quo, it's more of recent issues. Within that, in the context of urgency and the context of the predicted drought, you should be able to invest these solutions in the long term. So when you are building when you are let's say finding like irrigation pipes, you find ones that will be able to stand the test of time. When you are researching into storage issues, you find those that will be able to stand the test of time, and not those that will last for a day or two. But then I will engage OG for some of the frivolous things that they say. So we are debating this debate in the context of the Kenyan government. OG tries to be sneaky when they decide to create a policy as opposed to how these things have been implemented. Like the issue on importation is in the info slide. They cannot debate the info slide and expect to win the debate. But let me engage what she says. The first thing is this: we are being taught in schools. I can create it in my lab. First of all, the info. I think the first response is that there is zero analysis to show that what is being taught in school can actually be scaled up to be able to solve the problem in that particular regard. Because it is assertive because I can make probably a car in my school, then the government should stop importing cars and then come and use the cars. The world does not work that way, right? There are so many things that African is being taught in school because we know the science, but there is no analysis and there is no mechanism on their side to prove that these things can be scaled up. People produce automobiles in their classes, but government still import cars. Then Elisha comes to say, we can only get this technology insofar as we import them. First of all, things like patent laws and copyright prevent you from doing these things. But secondly, we have been importing like mobile phones, we've been importing cars, and we've been importing a lot of things. But we still don't have an African producer of car that has everybody buying into this. That particular analysis is very flawed. For the team that engages short-term harms and long-term harms, vote close no opposition. Proudly, see you.
Thank you again to all teams. I invite you to shake hands, cross the floor, We'll have the results in about 15 minutes. Thank you.